Despite the sanctions imposed by the West, Russia appears to be thriving, and it appears that China and India are assisting them in raising oil exports to levels that exceed those of before the crisis with Ukraine. By the end of the second quarter, President Vladimir Putin said, there will be more revenue from oil and gas, and the economy is getting better as a result of rising global oil prices. Furthermore, OPEC and its allies, including Saudi Arabia and Russia, surprised the market lately by announcing additional production targets cuts starting in March, which resulted in a more than 5% increase in oil futures. Sanctions against Russian oil were first applied by the European Union last year. In December, they even outlawed the export of crude oil by sea. Furthermore, Australia, the G7, and the EU decided to cap the price of Russian crude oil at $60 per barrel. The cap, which is less expensive than those in other nations, will be adjusted every 2 months. For the last 2 months, Russian crude oil has been less expensive than the $60 threshold. European businesses are still able to provide associated services including insurance, financing, and shipping. Additional limitations and price caps were imposed on February 5, with an emphasis on higher-priced Russian refined oil products such as cooking fuel and diesel. Matt Sherwood, senior Europe and lead commodities analyst at the EU, said the goal is to rattle the Kremlin without hurting the world oil market. Russia reduced its crude oil production by 5%, or roughly 500,000 barrels, starting in March after the EU forbade it from exporting oil products on February 5. Experts predict that it will be more difficult to get around these limits because it is more difficult to find new markets for oil products than for crude oil. Additionally, Russia declared that any nation that includes the G7 price cap in its contracts will not be allowed to deal with it. If sanctions remain in place, the EU has predicted the emergence of 2 distinct oil markets, one that deals with cheap Russian oil and another that stays away from it. Even though Russia sold more gas and oil to Asian nations in 2023, its revenue from these exports fell by 50%. Moscow was therefore forced to liquidate its foreign exchange reserves in order to make up for the loss. According to Thomas O'Donnell, a lecturer at the Free University of Berlin and employee of the Wilson Center, revenue may decline further as long as logistical problems endure and oil prices decline. Additionally, he stated that although oil and gas prices were high in the first year, Russia was able to make up for the loss. Nevertheless, things are now more stable. O'Donnell is interested to know, though, if the US, the EU, and the G7 would keep putting pressure on Russia depending on how they see the market. According to Russian predictions, this year's oil and gas revenue will drop by 25%, from 11.6 trillion rubles to 8.9 trillion rubles, or $155 billion to $119 billion. Moscow will therefore need to find alternative sources of income. China and India will be major consumers of Russian energy in 2024, particularly crude oil. Already, Russia exports more than 3 million barrels of crude oil per day to Asian consumers drawn by the lower prices. China, meanwhile, plans to purchase more Russian crude oil in 2024 than does India. Russian refiners will have to cut back on their output of crude oil if their distillate exports fail to find new buyers following the EU ban on Russian goods. Thus, it might be necessary to temporarily raise Russian crude oil exports. Putin has now said that Russia can anticipate more gas and oil revenues in the months to come. In 2024, Russia's budget deficit amounted to $29 billion during the initial quarter. The primary cause of this was decreased revenue from energy exports, which were negatively impacted by Western sanctions. Putin commended the nation's economy for remaining robust in spite of the sanctions at a government meeting that was broadcast on television. He pointed out that during the same time period, Russia's revenue from oil and gas, a crucial component of the national budget, decreased by almost 1.3 trillion rubles, or $15.8 billion. With rising oil prices, a shift in the situation is anticipated by the end of the second quarter. Putin claimed that more money will be coming into the budget as a result. Additionally, Russia was expected to have a larger budget deficit and a lower current account surplus this year by the International Monetary Fund. They added that reduced energy revenues and Russia's isolation from the rest of the world will hurt the country's chances of growth in the coming years. The IMF reduced its 2024 prediction from 2.1% to 1.3%, even as it increased its GDP estimate for Russia from 0.3% to 0.7%. Furthermore, the IMF believes that the country's economy will suffer from a lack of manpower and the departure of Western businesses. Can the United States now halt Russia's oil exports to China? China isn't taking the concept of halting Russian oil exports seriously, but there are worries that Taiwan could be blocked or placed under quarantine by China. Western analysts are considering how best to react as a result of this concern. In times of peace, A boycott of Russian oil supply to China would be dangerous, ineffective, and possibly worsen the situation. Nonetheless, in the event of a war or impending conflict, such as a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, the West might, if necessary, halt Russian oil supplies to China. In any case, there are significant hazards associated with the idea of halting Russian oil supplies. The West's already tense relations with Beijing and Moscow would be severely damaged if a blockade were imposed. In addition, the naval prowess of China and Russia would make enforcement difficult. The reputation of the West would suffer if efforts to impede exports were made but failed. Furthermore, having Chinese, Russian, and American warships near one another would cause even more issues. A blockade should only be used as a last resort due to these risks. However, Western forces might attempt to sabotage the oil traffic between Russia and China through covert or cyber means if there was a blockade or quarantine of Taiwan or in another wartime situation. However, these choices would not be without significant hazards. Unless they develop more pipelines to China, Russia will probably continue to ship its oil to China primarily by sea. The US and its allies could, if necessary, prevent the Russian ships from bringing oil to China, but doing so would be extremely risky, pointless, and have little impact on China's imports of oil. Rather than focusing on other means of exerting pressure, the West ought to pay attention to the possibility of China attacking Taiwan. It's not a good idea, according to experts, to stop Russia from exporting oil to China. Reuters reported on Wednesday, citing an industry source, that although Saudi Arabia may have surprised markets by announcing it would abandon its plan to raise oil production capacity to 13 million barrels per day, BPD, the decision was being considered for at least 6 months due to worries that the world's top crude exporter wasn't fully monetizing its excess capacity. The kingdom's leadership has directed Saudi national oil giant Aramco to halt efforts to increase its maximum sustainable capacity to 13 million barrels per day, BPD, and instead maintain it at 12 million BPD, the company announced on Tuesday. The largest oil company in the world said in a statement that a 2017 law sets the state's maximum sustainable capacity. When Aramco releases its 2023 financial results in March, it will also include an announcement on how it would amend its capital spending plans for the year to comply with the new government order. In 2021, the state oil firm of Saudi Arabia declared its intention to increase its production capacity to 13 million barrels per day. According to Chief Executive Amin Nasser at the time, the capacity expansion will be completely operational by 2027 and implemented gradually. The Saudi kings, however, have now concluded that it might not be necessary to increase the capacity above 12 million barrels per day. Although markets were taken aback by the kingdom's decision to drop the 13 million barrels per day target, the concept had been discussed for at least 6 months. According to a Reuters source, the decision originated from the top. Rarely has Saudi Arabia supplied the market with oil than 11 million barrels per day, BPD. One such instance was in the early months of 2020 during the full-fledged price war with Russia, when prices were plunging due to COVID's destruction of demand. As per the terms of the OPEC Plus agreement, Saudi Arabia currently produces 9 million barrels per day of petroleum. In addition, the kingdom voluntarily reduces its output by an additional 1 million barrels per day as part of OPEC Plus. Aramco's CEO Nasser stated in October that the company's spare oil production capacity now stands at 3 million BPD, despite Saudi Arabia having been pumping 9 million BPD for months. What are your thoughts on Russia's new oil and gas deals with Saudi Arabia, China and India? Let me know down below. If you want to continue to learn about business investing and financial education, we have got this video waiting on the screen for you to check out. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.